August 25, 1940. The first British bombs fall on Berlin, breaking a psychological barrier that will have profound consequences for both nations. What begins as a symbolic gesture, retaliation for a mistaken German raid on London, will evolve into one of the most sustained bombing campaigns in military history. Over the next 5 years, Berlin will endure 363 air raids, more than 45,000 tons of bombs, and transformation from the proud capital of the Third Reich into a shattered wasteland of rubble and despair. This is not simply the story of bombs and tonnage, though those numbers are staggering. It is the story of two air forces locked in a brutal contest of endurance and will. It is the account of British RAF crews flying night missions through flak and fighters, and American B-17 crews facing daylight gauntlets of German interceptors. It is the chronicle of German civilians enduring years of terror from above, and the Nazi regime's desperate efforts to maintain control as their capital burns. The campaign will see both sides push technology and tactics to their limits. Radar, pathfinder techniques, fighter escorts, and increasingly powerful bombs will all emerge from this aerial crucible. By 1945, when the bombing finally ceases, Berlin will lie in ruins, 70% of the city center destroyed, 50,000 civilians dead, and 1.5 million homeless. Yet the strategic debate continues. Did bombing break German will, or did it merely create rubble for Soviet tanks to conquer? This is the Battle of Berlin, fought not in a day or a week, but across 5 long years of fire from the sky. Phase 1. Symbolic Strikes 1941-942. The bombing of Berlin began almost by accident. On the night of August 24, 1940, German bombers targeting oil installations near London mistakenly dropped bombs on the city itself. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, seeking retaliation and wanting to demonstrate that Britain could strike back, immediately ordered raids on Berlin. The next night, 81 RAF bombers set course for the German capital. The raid was more symbolic than destructive. Poor weather, limited navigation technology, and the vast distance from British bases meant most bombs fell harmlessly in fields and forests surrounding Berlin. But the psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, bombs had fallen on the Reich capital. Adolf Hitler, who had boasted that no enemy bomber would reach Berlin, was humiliated. In a rage, he ordered the Luftwaffe to shift from attacking RAF airfields to bombing London, a strategic mistake that allowed Fighter Command to recover and ultimately win the Battle of Britain. These early raids established patterns that would persist throughout the war. RAF Bomber Command, led by Air Marshal Arthur Harris from February 1942, adopted a doctrine of area bombing. Unable to hit specific targets with precision at night, Harris advocated destroying entire urban areas to break German morale and industrial capacity. Berlin, as the capital and symbolic heart of Nazi Germany, became a priority target whenever weather and resources permitted. The distances involved made Berlin raids particularly challenging. Bombers had to fly over 600 miles each way, exposed to German night fighters and anti-aircraft defenses for hours. Early aircraft like the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley and Vickers Wellington lacked the range, payload, and defensive armament for sustained operations. Losses were severe, sometimes reaching 10% or more of attacking forces. Crews needed extraordinary courage to volunteer for Berlin missions, knowing their odds of completing a tour of operations diminished with each trip to Big City, as they called it. Technical limitations severely constrained early raids. Navigation relied on dead reckoning and celestial observation, both unreliable in the cloudy skies over northern Germany. Bomb sites were primitive by later standards. The bomber stream concept, concentrating aircraft to overwhelm defenses, had not yet been developed. Bombers flew individually, making them vulnerable to prowling night fighters. Results were accordingly modest. Between August 1940 and March 1942, RAF Bomber Command conducted 32 raids on Berlin, dropping approximately 1,500 tons of bombs and causing scattered damage, but nothing approaching the devastation that would come later. German defenses improved steadily. The Kammhuber Line, a system of radar stations, searchlights, anti-aircraft guns, and fighter zones stretching across occupied Europe, became increasingly effective. Twin-engine night fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 110 and Junkers Ju 88, equipped with Liechtenstein radar, could locate and destroy British bombers in darkness. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed Berlin with hundreds of heavy flak guns. Air raid shelters, both above-ground concrete bunkers and underground facilities, provided protection for the civilian population. Phase 2. The Battle of Berlin, 1943–1944. Air Marshal Arthur Harris believed strategic bombing could win the war without requiring a costly invasion of Europe. In November 1943, he launched what became known as the Battle of Berlin, a sustained campaign intended to destroy the German capital and break Nazi resistance. Harris famously declared, "It will cost Germany the war." The campaign coincided with significant improvements in RAF capabilities. The new Avro Lancaster heavy bomber could carry 14,000 pounds of ordnance to Berlin and defend itself with 8 machine guns. The Handley Page Halifax and Short Sterling provided additional heavy bomber capacity. Most critically, Bomber Command had developed the Pathfinder Force, elite squadrons using H-2S ground mapping radar and special target indicators to mark targets for the main bomber stream. This allowed more concentrated attacks on specific urban areas, rather than bombs scattered across the countryside. The Battle of Berlin officially ran from November 18, 1943, to March 24, 1944, though raids continued afterward. During these 4 months, Bomber Command launched 16 major attacks on Berlin plus dozens of raids on other German cities. More than 9,000 sorties targeted the German capital, dropping over 30,000 tons of bombs. The attacks followed a deliberate pattern. Pathfinders would mark the target with colored flares and incendiaries, followed by waves of heavy bombers dropping high explosives to blow off roofs and shatter buildings, then incendiaries to ignite the exposed interiors. The goal was to create firestorms similar to those that had devastated Hamburg in July 1943. Berlin's geography worked against firestorm development. Unlike Hamburg's densely packed medieval center with timber frame buildings, Berlin was a modern city with wide streets, stone and concrete construction, and numerous parks and waterways that acted as fire breaks. While individual neighborhoods suffered catastrophic damage, the city-wide conflagration Harris envisioned never materialized. Nevertheless, the cumulative destruction was immense. By March 1944, over 4,000 acres of Berlin had been destroyed, 1.5 million people evacuated, and approximately 10,000 civilians killed. The cost to Bomber Command was staggering. German defenses by late 1943 represented the most sophisticated air defense system ever created. The Kammhuber Line had evolved into a complex network of radar-guided fighters, searchlight batteries, and flak zones. Luftwaffe night fighter aces like Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, 121 victories, and Helmut Lent, 110 victories, developed devastating tactics. They would infiltrate the bomber stream, often attacking from below where bombers had no defensive armament, systematically destroying aircraft throughout the long flight to and from Berlin. Between November 1943 and March 1944, Bomber Command lost 625 aircraft over Berlin and other targets during the campaign, roughly 6.5% of attacking forces. Each aircraft carried 7 crew members, meaning over 4,000 airmen were killed or captured in just 4 months. The psychological toll was immense. Bomber crews had to complete 30 operations to finish a tour. With loss rates around 6%, simple mathematics suggested few would survive. Yet they continued to volunteer, climb into their aircraft, and fly into the darkness toward Berlin. The campaign's climax came on the night of March 24-25, 1944, during a raid on Nuremberg. German controllers successfully directed night fighters into the bomber stream, and perfect visibility allowed them to attack throughout the route. Bomber Command lost 96 aircraft, 9% of the attacking force, in a single night. This disaster effectively ended the Battle of Berlin. Harris had not broken German morale or forced surrender. Berlin still functioned, though heavily damaged. The Luftwaffe remained dangerous, and Bomber Command needed to conserve strength for supporting the upcoming Normandy invasion. Phase 3. American Daylight RAIDS, 1944. While the RAF bombed by night, the United States Army Air Forces pursued a different strategy: high-altitude daylight precision bombing. American doctrine held that heavily armed B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, flying in tight defensive formations, could fight their way to targets, bomb with precision using the advanced Norden bombsight, and return without prohibitive losses. Berlin would test this theory to its limits. The USAAF's 8th Air Force, based in England, initially avoided Berlin due to the distance and anticipated defenses. The first American raid on Berlin occurred on March 4, 1944, when 660 B-17s and B-24s targeted the city in daylight. The Americans flew in combat box formations designed to mask their defensive firepower against German fighters. Each carried 13.50 caliber machine guns, creating interlocking fields of fire that theoretically made formations impregnable. Reality proved more challenging. German fighters attacked with determination, concentrating on individual bombers to break formation integrity. The Luftwaffe employed head-on attacks, accepting the concentrated defensive fire to maximize their own hit probability. FW-190s and Bf-109s would dive through formations, guns blazing, then wheel around for another pass. Some aircraft mounted 30 cannons or even 21 cm rockets that could destroy a B-17 with a single hit. The March 4th raid cost 69 bombers and over 600 airmen. Subsequent raids in March saw similarly heavy losses. The crisis passed only with the introduction of long-range fighter escorts. The North American P-51 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks, could accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Suddenly, German fighters faced a dilemma: attack the bombers and face American fighters, or attack the fighters and leave the bombers alone. Either way, the Luftwaffe took unsustainable losses. By spring 1944, the 8th Air Force achieved air superiority over Germany. With Mustang escorts overhead, American bombers could attack Berlin repeatedly with acceptable losses. Between March and May 1944, the USAAF conducted over 20 daylight raids on Berlin, dropping thousands of tons of bombs with greater precision than night raids achieved. Industrial targets, rail yards, and government buildings suffered heavy damage. American and British raids increasingly complemented each other. The RAF would bomb by night, forcing German civilians into shelters and disrupting city services. The USAAF would attack by day, hitting specific industrial and transportation targets while German workers struggled to maintain production amid the chaos. This round-the-clock bombing gave Berlin no respite. Air raid sirens wailed day and night. Fires burned constantly. The population lived in a state of permanent exhaustion and fear. Phase 4. Final Destruction 1945. By 1945, the strategic situation had transformed completely. Allied forces had liberated France, crossed the Rhine, and were advancing into Germany itself. Soviet armies were pushing from the east, approaching Berlin. The Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortages and the loss of experienced pilots, could barely contest Allied air superiority. Germany's war industries, dispersed and damaged, produced at a fraction of capacity. Yet the bombing continued. The final phase of Berlin's bombing was the most destructive. With German defenses weakened, Allied bombers could attack in massive formations with minimal losses. The raids of February and March 1945 brought apocalyptic destruction to Berlin. On February 3, 1945, the USAAF launched its largest raid on Berlin. 937 bombers escorted by 575 fighters. They dropped 2,266 tons of bombs in less than an hour, killing an estimated 2,500 to 3,000 civilians, many of them refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army. The most controversial raid occurred on the night of February 3-4, immediately following the American attack. RAF Bomber Command sent 495 Lancasters and Halifaxes to Berlin, dropping 1,400 tons of bombs on a city already reeling from the daytime raid. The combined attacks created scenes of unprecedented horror. Berlin's air defenses had largely ceased functioning. Firestorms erupted in several districts. Rescue services, overwhelmed by years of raids and shortages of equipment, could barely respond. Thousands died in the flames or from smoke inhalation in overcrowded shelters. This pattern repeated through March and into April. The raids served multiple purposes. Militarily, they disrupted German command and control as the Battle of Berlin approached. They destroyed transportation networks that might allow German forces to reinforce the capital. Psychologically, they demonstrated Allied power and German helplessness. Strategically, they prepared the battlefield for Soviet ground forces by reducing the city to rubble. The final RAF raid on Berlin occurred on the night of April 21, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday. It was symbolic rather than strategic. The city was already doomed. Surrounded by Soviet armies, the last American raid came on April 15. By then, Berlin was a moonscape of destruction. Entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. Major landmarks were destroyed or damaged beyond recognition. The once proud capital resembled an ancient ruin, its buildings hollow shells, its streets clogged with rubble. When Soviet forces entered Berlin on April 21, they found a city that was already dead. The bombing, combined with street fighting, had reduced much of Berlin to fragments. Of the 1.5 million buildings in the greater Berlin area, approximately 600,000 were damaged or destroyed. Some 50,000 civilians had been killed by bombs, with another 25,000 dying in the final ground battle. The population, which stood at 4.3 million in 1939, had fallen to 2.8 million through evacuation, death, and flight. For Berlin's civilian population, the bombing campaign meant years of terror, privation, and loss. Air raid sirens became the soundtrack of daily life. When they sounded, and they sounded frequently, millions of people had minutes to reach shelters. Some huddled in basement shelters of apartment buildings, reinforced with timbers and sandbags. Others fled to massive concrete flak towers, fortress-like structures that doubled as anti-aircraft platforms and public shelters, protecting up to 10,000 people. The privileged accessed deep underground bunkers with reinforced ceilings, medical facilities, and adequate supplies. The vast majority had inadequate protection. Basement shelters could survive near misses but not direct hits. Overcrowding was universal. In many shelters, families would mark their space with chalk and defend it jealously. The air was thick with dust, fear, and the smell of too many people in too small a space. Children learned to recognize different sounds: the air raid warning, the all clear, the whistle of falling bombs, and the distinctive crump of explosions. Above ground, the city transformed with each major raid. Familiar streets became unrecognizable mazes of rubble. Navigation became a challenge. Landmarks disappeared overnight. Berliners developed dark humor about their situation. They called the ruins Reichsruinen, Reich ruins, and joked that they could now see all the way to Moscow, since everything in between had been flattened. Daily life became a struggle for survival. Disrupted infrastructure meant irregular utilities. Water, gas, and electricity failed frequently. Food distribution broke down, forcing people to walk miles for rations. Schools closed, either destroyed or converted to emergency use. Hospitals overflowed with casualties. The smell of death permeated neighborhoods where bodies lay buried in rubble for days or weeks. The Nazi regime struggled to maintain control. Propaganda emphasized retaliation weapons, the V-1 and V-2 rockets, promising revenge against Britain. Officials insisted that Germany will remain unbroken, that final victory was certain. But the gap between propaganda and reality widened with each raid. People could see that Germany was losing, that the promised wonder weapons changed nothing, that the regime's boasts were hollow. Yet organized resistance remained minimal. The totalitarian surveillance state, fear of consequences, and absence of alternatives kept most Berliners compliant. Some helped down Allied airmen, risking execution if discovered. Others listened to forbidden BBC broadcasts for news. But open defiance was rare. Most simply endured, hoping to survive until the war ended. Psychological trauma was universal but rarely acknowledged. Children who grew up during the bombing, the so-called rebel children, carried scars for life. Adults developed what we would now recognize as PTSD, hypervigilance, anxiety, nightmares, inability to trust peace. The constant stress, combined with inadequate nutrition and horrific experiences, damaged entire generations. The bombing of Berlin and strategic bombing generally remains intensely controversial. Did it achieve its strategic objectives? Did the human cost on both sides justify the results? Proponents argue that bombing significantly contributed to Allied victory. It forced Germany to divert massive resources to air defense. Thousands of fighters, hundreds of thousands of personnel for flak batteries and civil defense, industrial capacity for producing defensive systems rather than offensive weapons. It destroyed industrial facilities, disrupted transportation networks, and reduced German war production below potential levels. It undermined civilian morale, though it did not break it. It forced dispersal of industry, making production less efficient. Most importantly, it drew German fighters into battles they could not win, achieving air superiority that proved crucial for D-Day and subsequent operations. Critics counter that bombing was ineffective and immoral. German war production actually increased through 1944 despite the bombing, reaching peak output only months before collapse. Civilian morale did not break. Germans continued working and fighting until occupation. The resources devoted to bombing, aircraft, crews, bombs, fuel, might have produced better results if invested in tactical support, anti-submarine warfare, or other priorities. The death toll was unconscionable. 50,000 Berlin civilians plus hundreds of thousands in other German cities, against minimal military benefit. Area bombing of cities constituted terror warfare, deliberately targeting non-combatants, morally indistinguishable from Nazi atrocities. Modern consensus suggests a nuanced middle position. Bombing did not single-handedly win the war but significantly contributed to victory. Its effectiveness varied by target and timing. Precision attacks on oil refineries in late 1944 crippled German mobility. Transportation bombing disrupted military movements. Industrial bombing reduced production below potential levels. Area bombing of cities was the least effective but diverted resources to defense. The moral dimension remains unresolved. By 1945, the line between military and civilian targets had blurred beyond recognition. Total war meant entire societies were mobilized for conflict. Berlin contained government ministries directing the war, transportation networks moving military supplies, industries producing weapons, and civilians supporting those industries. In this context, the entire city became a legitimate target by military logic. But human conscience recoils at the deliberate killing of civilians, even enemy civilians. When the bombing finally ceased in April 1945, Berlin lay shattered. The physical destruction was overwhelming. 70% of the city center destroyed, 50% of all buildings damaged or demolished, infrastructure in ruins. The human toll was equally staggering: 50,000 killed, hundreds of thousands wounded, 1.5 million homeless, psychological trauma affecting millions. The bombers had achieved their immediate objective. Berlin could no longer function as Germany's capital. Its government fled to bunkers, its industries ceased production, its population struggled merely to survive. As a strategic objective, Berlin had been neutralized. As a symbol of Nazi power, it had been obliterated. Yet the moral questions persist. Was this level of destruction necessary? Could more selective targeting have achieved similar results with less civilian suffering? Did the end, defeating Nazi Germany, justify these means? Each generation must wrestle with these questions anew. For the Allied aircrews, the campaign represented extraordinary sacrifice. RAF Bomber Command suffered 55,573 killed during the war, the highest death rate of any British service. American bomber crews faced similar dangers, with thousands killed over Germany. These men volunteered for missions they knew were suicidal, believing their sacrifice would shorten the war and save lives overall. Their courage deserves recognition, even as we debate the strategy they executed. For Berlin survivors, rebuilding began amid the ruins. The city would remain divided for 45 years, a symbol of Cold War tensions. Even after reunification, reminders of the bombing persist: empty lots where buildings once stood, modern structures amid 19th-century neighbors, plaques marking shelter locations. The Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, left partially ruined as a memorial, stands as testimony to the bombing's destructive power. The Battle of Berlin demonstrates both the potential and the limitations of air power. Bombing can devastate cities, disrupt economies, and terrorize populations, but it cannot, by itself, compel surrender. Victory required armies to advance, occupy territory, and impose peace. The bombs prepared the way, creating rubble for Soviet tanks to conquer, but they could not achieve victory alone. Today, as we examine this history, we must hold multiple truths simultaneously. The bombing was strategically important and morally troubling. The aircrews were courageous, and their mission was terrible. Nazi Germany deserved defeat, and German civilians did not deserve this suffering. War creates impossible choices, and easy moral judgments serve no one. The ruins of Berlin remind us that war's costs extend far beyond battlefield casualties, that civilian suffering cannot be separated from military conflict, and that the choices we make during war echo through generations. 5 years of bombing transformed Berlin from a proud capital into a field of rubble. The physical city was rebuilt, but the scars, both visible and invisible, remain, warning future generations about the true cost of total war.